Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome to KBL. In fact, KBL is Kehilat Belechem. Kehilat is part of the today's Torah portion word. Vayakhel. Kahel is kahal. And so we're Kehilat, which is the church of the house of bread. The assembly, the congregation of the house of bread, the community of the house of bread. And so today's Torah portion, we've got to kind of backtrack and recap a little bit because it's connected to the Torah portion teruma. Teruma means to give an offering from a willing heart. It's a love offering. It's not a commandment. In fact, the only commandment is you be willing. And Moses gets a contribution because God says, I want you to make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among you. And he wants to dwell among us like he did at the beginning. He walked with us in the cool of the day with Adam and Eve. That's what he wants. He wants to be among his family. And then Adam and Eve changed that. And so this is the next attempt that God wants to dwell with his people in a spirit of community, the community that contributes for the tabernacle, for the dwelling place and the home of God. And this community comes after just a golden calf of experience, right? They're waiting for Moses to come down to find out if they're atoned for. He shows up. He's got 2 new tablets. He's shining like the sun. And they go, God has given us favor. God has atoned for our sin. And so I'm thinking with that gratitude, they're contributing everything they have. I mean, and this is a contribution, whether it was a piece of yarn or a basket of gold. Everything from a willing heart was accepted, and that made you part of that dwelling place. You're part of that project. And you'll see that in the next Torah portion, Pikudei, where Moses takes an accounting, and it's almost like he's accounting for, this is the things, that Joe brought and Jill brought, and, and not counting its worth, but that your name is in the contribution, that you contributed to this tabernacle, this dwelling place for the God of the universe, the possessor of heaven and earth. And so in that Torah portion, he says, dwell me a dwelling place that I may dwell among you. And you can see in this picture that God is in the middle, and they're dwelling, and he's dwelling among the tents of Israel. And his presence is there. I mean, God doesn't need a place. He has the whole universe, but he wants to dwell here. He wants to dwell among his people. And that Hebrew word to dwell among is betokim. And it can mean among, but it can also mean within. And so God says, I want you to build me this tabernacle that we see here in this picture. He says, according to the pattern that's on the mountain, and I want it to look exactly like what you see, Moses. So Moses goes to the top of the mountain. The clouds come down on the top. So this is in heaven. God has brought heaven down to the top of the mountain, brought Moses up to the top of the mountain to see what's in the heavenlies. And this tabernacle is in the heavenlies. And he says, I want you to make this is the true tabernacle. I want you to make a copy and shadow of it on the earth. Because this is where I dwell in heaven, but I want to dwell among you on earth. And this is this is a holy place. And then, so the like I mentioned last time, that almost half of the book of Exodus is dedicated to the details of this tabernacle. It's a mobile home. It's made to travel. And almost the half of the book of Exodus is dedicated to the details, because God is saying, I want it to look like the one in heaven. I want that to look like on earth. And then we see that the details of this tabernacle, in Exodus 26 and 27, you see that God is describing places that where these contributions are going to be made and what they're going to be made into and where they're going to go. And he mentions a hand and a side and a hip and a face and a head. He begins to mention human body parts as part of this tabernacle, because he wants us to see that this tabernacle on earth is the worship center on earth that mirrors the one in heaven, and eventually he wants that to look like a man, because that word betokim means I want to dwell within you. Paul gets this picture. He's reading the Hebrew, he's understanding the message, and Paul understands that when he says in Corinthians, don't you know that we are the tabernacle, the temple of God? So and then he quotes the verse right out of Exodus 25. So it's clear that Paul sees it exactly as we're describing, that God's intended purpose would to build a tabernacle on the earth, that I may dwell among you, but my goal is to dwell within you. And when did that happen? In Acts 2, when the Spirit come down and entered into the apostles, and now God, the living God, the Shekinah, was now dwelling within his people. And then it began to spread. And so we are to be a representation of the tabernacle in heaven and its holiness and all that goes on in there. And we see that this tabernacle in heaven has angelic priests. And they have functions. One takes a live coal from the altar and atones Isaiah's lips. That's priestly functions. That's a live coal from a real fire in the heavenlies. And so as we go through all the details, God says, I want this here, and I want this, and I want this where the hand goes, and where the face goes, and this is the hand. He's describing a human being, and he's describing what he eventually wants us to be, as he wants us to be that worship center on earth that mirrors the one in heaven. It's a beautiful picture, but it's a high calling, as Chris says. It's a high calling. And if you don't understand what God's saying there, you'll miss your responsibility and your accountability to be as the tabernacle, the worship center here on earth. Okay, so we understand that there's this tabernacle with live priests doing functioning duties. They're worshiping on Shabbat, they're worshiping Passover, all the feast. They are functioning. And then God says, what happens up here, I want that to happen down there in that tabernacle, Moses. I want you to celebrate Passover. I want you to celebrate the Sabbath on the Sabbath. I want the Passover on the on the day of Passover. Right? And we mentioned that the people in Qumran understood this from this language and from the whole language of the Bible, that what's going on in the heavens is liturgy. Hebrews 1:14 says that the angels are doing church stuff in the heavenlies for those who will inherit salvation. It's a beautiful picture. But he says, I want what's going on up here, I want that to happen here on earth, and eventually I want that worship center to be you, and I want you to be doing Shabbat, and I want you to be doing Passover on Passover. You're the representative of the tabernacle in the heavens. How can we represent the tabernacle in heaven that God obviously wants to dwell within if we're not performing the same way as the one in the heavens? And so then we move forward. Then we go, okay, now it's a live tabernacle. It's a fully functioning worship center with priests and tools and shovels and prongs for the burnt offering and for the live coals. And then I ask the question, who's the high priest of this tabernacle in the heaven? Because to be fully functioning, it's got to have a high priest. And so then we made the case that high priest was Melchizedek. And I showed how I believe that Melchizedek, the one that visited Abraham in Genesis 14, who says he's a Melchizedek, a king of righteousness, who is a priest of the Most High God, and he is the king of Salem, the king of peace. Well, you know, that's in the Canaanite area. The time Abraham lived there, it was the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Jebusites and, you know, the ites. God says, you know, Abraham, you're going to have to give these guys an eviction notice because I'm moving you in. And so, because they were idolaters, they were pagans and worshiped multiple gods. And not only was they in there, and that Joshua eventually has to go in and clear them all out. He not only had to clear them out, he had to clear out the Nephilim, the giants, the giant clans. They had to be cleared out of the land of Canaan. So this king of Salem is not that area. It's not in that area. Because that king would have been king over Nephilims and Canaanites and Hittites. That's not working. So that's one question we have to ask. And then we got to go to and think, Abraham just went out and fought like 4 large empires, 4 large kingdoms, right? And these kingdoms just was sweeping through the land like locusts, taking captivity, taking the spoils of the cities and just leaving them desolate. Then they get to Sodom and they wipe them out and they grab captivities, and one of them happens to be Lot. And then Abraham, going against like 4 kingdoms, takes 313 guys and wipes them out. Not only wins the battle, it's got to be supernatural. He gets the captives. He gets all the spoils from all this rampage that they've done. And he brings back Lot with 313 guys. The war's over. Abraham's got the spoils. Return the captivities back to where they belong. And a guy shows up with bread and wine and says, "Blessed are you, Abraham, for God has delivered you from your enemies." And he says, "I am the king, the Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. I am the priest of El Elyon." That's very specific. King of the Most High. And I'm the king of Salem, which means peace. I'm the king of peace. You know, I mean, we have Jerusalem, but that's not the city of peace. Very rarely in its history has been a city of peace. And then in Psalm 76, it talks about Zion and Salem. The only other place that word Salem is mentioned, and it has hints that it's the Zion in the heavens, that Paul says the Jerusalem that's above. So Melchizedek is the King of peace, the one that's in the heavenlies, the one that's the Jerusalem above, and he's a priest, and a priest and a king. Well, Melchizedek, there was no priestly system at the time of Abraham. There was no Levitical priest, and even if it was, they didn't allow you to be a priest and a king. You were either from the line of Judah for the kingship or the line of Levi for the priesthood. There wasn't both, but here there's two in a time that there was no priesthood set up. So what's going on here? Was this a pre-existing priesthood? That's what I'm suggesting. And how did Abraham know that this guy was the priest of the Most High, and he's going to give him a tenth of all the spoils? It had to be a huge contribution. And he's just going to turn it over to a guy that just brings him bread and wine? No, Abraham knew something. He knew way more than we're told in the Bible. Right? How did he know this? How did he get exposure to give him a tithe? The tithe's never even mentioned. This is the first time a tithe is mentioned. It's not mentioned until Moses gives the instructions to give a tithe. But Abraham knows to give a tenth. There's something that's a priesthood that's pre-Mount Sinai. And I'm saying that Melchizedek, the one that was in that priesthood, the one that's the king of the peace, that's the high priest of this fully functional tabernacle in heaven, is the one that's still a high priest of the fully functioning tabernacle in heaven today. You know, Hebrews lays it out. He says it is an everlasting priesthood. It's not transferable. So then we make the case that John the Baptist comes in, and Jesus travels from the Galilee area all the way to Bethabara, which is over there by the Dead Sea Scrolls. And John the Baptist is baptizing there, and Jesus travels 80 miles, bypasses Jerusalem, which is full of priests, but he doesn't think they're legitimate priests. They've been compromised all the way back to the Maccabean area, and they just continued in that corruption. You know, we can see hints of that. When Jesus doesn't even call priests, he calls them scribes and Pharisees. He doesn't even give them the dignity of calling them priests. And so Jesus travels 80 miles to come all the way down to Bethabara to meet John the Baptist, to be baptized by John. And he says, John, it's between you and me, because you're the one crying, you're the one in the voice, you're the one preparing the way for the king, and I'm the king you're preparing it for. This has to be between you and me. You and me. This is a job that Isaiah says was for us too, right? And then he says, John says, I should be baptized by you, because John is baptizing for the remission of sins. You know, John says, I qualify that, but you don't. Well, Jesus is not there to be baptized for the remission of sins. And then we find out that only a priest, a Levite priest, can authorize baptism. He's the only one that's authorized. That's why you see in Acts it says, Apollos says, well, what baptism you know? He goes, I only know the one of John. Because he was a Levite priest. You know, you couldn't go get baptized in the name of Jeff. I'm not a Levite priest. I don't have the authority to do that. But John the Baptist did. And so when they said I was baptized in John's baptism, it's meaning I was baptizing under John's legitimate authority to baptize me. Well, then what happens when the Levites are gone? And Peter says, well, be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. Well, who's Jesus? He's the Melchizedek priesthood. He has the priesthood right to baptize us, but that's to be a baptism in fire. So, all these little pieces that comes from the Old Testament, we need them. We can't figure it out without them. It's too important. So this begins the Torah portion, and the one thing is teruma, and this Torah portion Vayakhel, which means and he called, he assembled, he churched, called the church. There's a couple of differences. Otherwise, it's almost a word-by-word play. And so it says that Moses gathered, or kahald, Vayachahal, or kehelid, like us, the congregation of the children of Israel together, and said to them, these are the words which the Lord has commanded you to do. Now, this is one of the first things that's different between the teruma Torah portion. He says, get me a contribution from the willing hearts. And this is the shopping list. And it's a detailed shopping list of gold, silver, yarn, wood, all that stuff, right? Details. And he says, and then I want them from a willing heart. Well, this time, he's starting the same Torah portion. Some people call it Pete and repeat because the words are almost exactly word for word in some of the areas. But this is one of the differences. And he says, these are the words which the Lord is commanding you to do. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh day shall be holy to you, a Sabbath rest to the Lord. Not to Bob or not to your pastor, to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. God is saying here, this is extremely important. They're about to build the tabernacle, which is sacred space, where the Most High will move into their neighborhood. But there's also this thing called the Sabbath, which is sacred time. And God set it apart for his purpose. And he wants us to know it's important. And he says, whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. Now this is under who's the king at this time? God is the king of this kingdom, right? Later, Israel says, we want a human king. Well, then they finally get Saul, and now the authority of that kingdom is now under Saul. But when it's under the God Most High, his says you break the Sabbath, you're dead. And we see the guy picking up sticks later on in number 6. He's picking up sticks. They go, what should we do, Moses? He says, take him out. God says to Moses, take him out of camp and throw rocks at him. He didn't get a chance. He couldn't bring a cow or a lamb or a sheep or a sacrifice for his replacement. So that causes us to say, okay, substitution atonement doesn't apply there, and maybe it doesn't apply at all, or maybe it kind of does. It's a big topic. So, very first thing is, you're about to ready to build a tabernacle, but the Sabbath is still the Sabbath. So, if you're building the tabernacle, don't do it on the Sabbath. That's sacred time. That's sacred space. You can't mix them up. So that's one of the things that there's difference between teruma and Vayakhel. And then the other thing is that teruma is about instructions on how to gather the contributions. In Vayakhel, which is this portion, it's more about construction. It's about the action of building the temple. Because it's like a word for word, the rings and the poles and the bars and all the same details. And he's still, it's like God saying, this is important, and I'm going to walk you through every step of this. because it's got to look like the pattern on the mountain. So that's the two differences between these two Torah portions. In verse 4, Moses spoke to all the congregation of the children, saying, this is the thing which the Lord commanded. Take from you, among you, the offering to the Lord, who is of a willing heart. This is a love offering. It's not a commandment. It's a request to build the tabernacle, to build the house for the king. Let him bring it in as an offering to the Lord, gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, scarlet thread, fine linen, goat's hair, ram skins, dyed badger skins, acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil, and for the sweet spices, onyx stones, and stones to be set in the ephod, in the breastplates. You know, and then it just goes on, because it's, like I said, almost half the chapter of Exodus, of details and details and details. And it goes on, and he made bars of acacia wood, 5 for the boards and on the side of the tabernacle, 5 bars for the boards on the other side of the tabernacle, 5 boards for the tabernacle on the far side and the west side, and he made the middle bar to pass through the board. You can see the detail that he's given the instructions that he needs him to follow and to pay attention to. Moses already seen the blueprint. Now he's just going over the details on how to construct it. And then down here in verse 40, God continually to remind him all the steps of the way, and see to it that you make it according to the pattern which was shown to you on the mountain. See to it that you make it according to the pattern. So we talked about this. Who was the high priest? That was Melchizedek. He was Melchizedek then, high priest. He's Melchizedek today. And then in the John the Baptist story, John says, I must decrease and you must increase, right? He's saying, he's not saying, I must decrease and working for the kingdom, because he continued to baptize people after that. So that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about, I must decrease in the Levitical priesthood. You're now being the priest of Melchizedek, because he couldn't be a priest of a Levite, but he was being ordained and baptized so that he could enter into some kind of a ministry of a priesthood. Hebrews says that he, Jesus, offered himself as a sacrifice. You can't do that unless you're a priest. He had to be a priest to offer himself as a sacrifice. He must have become a priest when John the Baptist baptized him and ordained him into the priesthood, right? Hebrews 7:12 says when there's a change in the priesthood, there's a change in the law. You know, and I hear, oh yeah, see, the law's been changed. You know, we got a different priest. It's a new covenant. It's a different covenant. And so it's a different law. That's not what Hebrews is saying. Because if you go to the Greek, the word change there is metathesis. And it means, better translation, transfer. So when there is a transfer to the priesthood, there's a transfer of the law. So it's a different administration. It's not a Levitical administration. It's been transferred to a Melchizedek transfer, and it's still the same law. They had lots of priests that died, and there was a change in the priesthood, but the Torah was changed, stayed the same, right? So, you know, but we're told, oh yeah, it's a new covenant, it's a new priesthood, it's a different law. That law's been done away with. That's not what Hebrews is saying. He's saying there was a transfer, and I'm saying that transfer happened at John the Baptist ordained Jesus, and that priesthood needed to increase. You know, lots to this. A lot of moving parts to this understanding. So then we got Melchizedek, and you know, and he drives out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. These are the people that were living in the land of Canaan, where the Jerusalem was, right? Melchizedek ain't the king over that city, right? So that can't be the city he's talking about. And it's the word Salem, which means peace. Eventually it becomes Jerusalem, but not the city that's filled with Canaanites and idolaters and giant clans. He's not the king of that area. He's the king of the one that Paul says, the Jerusalem above. Okay, so now we've covered all this area. And so that was the question I asked you, who was the high priest? And so we kind of addressed that. But when Moses goes up to the mountain, he sees his tabernacle. It's already there. Did God says, oh, yeah, Moses is coming up next week. We better assemble his tabernacle because I want him to take a look at it. See, to see if, so that he has a pattern to go off of. Was it just made? Was it barely made? Or was it from the beginning, right? And so I start doing all this research. When was this tabernacle? When did it come into existence? How long has it been there? And strangely, the only source I could get that even would suggest that it was there before, from the beginning, was the book of Jubilees. That's the only source. But we're going to see that there's lots of connections that agree with Jubilees. It's not saying anything different. It's just giving more details, but it gets validated in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And, how did Abraham know to give a tithe? How did he know that this was the kingdom of Salem? There's things, and we'll see that they had to known. There was already a pre-standard of behavior that was expected from the very beginning. And where did that standard come from? How do they know that, right? And Jubilee says, so if there's tablets in the tabernacle and the pattern on earth, then there's tablets in the ones in heaven, right? And there not only was there the book of the law that Moses put on the side of the tabernacle, or the side of the ark, there's got to be the same thing in heaven. It's as above, so below. And so, and Jubilee says there's heavenly tablets. I never made the connection, but, there's an ark in the heaven, and there's an ark here on earth. The ark's got tablets. The one in heaven's got to have tablets, right? And Jubilee says there's heavenly tablets. So, I'm testing this idea. I'm not that familiar with Jubilees. But, I'm not afraid to get out of the box. I'm not afraid to be wrong. I just don't want to stay that way, right? And we're going to see that, because, Christianity would say, don't be going to Jubilees and Enoch and stuff. That's not biblical stuff, right? Okay, and I believed them. They were the Rabbi Akivas of today, because Rabbi Akiva said, don't be reading those outside books, or there'll be no place for you in the kingdom to come. Oh, well, I don't want to do that, right? And those outside books were discrediting their behavior and everything they believed. Of course they don't want you to read it. Just like today, we got Rabbi Akivas today. They had Pharisees, and they have Pharisees today. And they're religious leaders. And so it's our job to read the Bible and read it for ourselves and become accountable to it and break it down. It's a lifetime journey. It's a journey, not a destination. And that's why we come here, is to discuss these matters so that we can better understand the context that God has for us, right? in a spirit of community. That's what communities are for. They're to build the house of God. They're to, so we can test each other and cause us to grow and become more knowledgeable and push us and tug us and correct us. I need all of that. So there was a thing called the Book of the Law that Moses wrote. We'll talk about that. And it refers to the Pentateuch, the 5 books of in the Bible that Moses given. And while the heavenly tablets or the heavenly scrolls appear in the ancient literature like the book of Jubilees as eternal cosmic records of divine law and human destiny. Eternal cosmic records of divine law. And that's the sense you get from Jubilees, is that this law was eternal, right? It goes back to the beginning, or maybe even before. And what's funny is that Rabbi Akiva, who was against these books, he said that the Torah was the instrument that created the universe, right? Well, he's lining up with Book of Jubilees, and he's the one that said don't read it. I think he read it. Or at least he's agreeing with it. Okay, so they appear in the literature like the Book of Jubilees as eternal cosmic records of divine law and human destiny. The stone tablets, the Decalogue, represent the immediate earthly immutable covenant, while the heavenly tabernacle symbolized a pre-existent divine unchangeable law nature of those laws. Let's see if we can find something that would validate this pre-existing divine unchangeable law, this standard that God would have from the beginning. So this book of the law is in Deuteronomy 31, and it says, so it was when Moses completed the writing of the words of this law in the book. So this is Deuteronomy 31. This is at the end of the journey. They're getting ready. Moses is getting ready to go up the mountain and take a long nap, and the Israelites are getting ready to go. Joshua's ready to take them back into the land. And so this is the journey's done. He's at the end. And he writes this book of the law of everything that he talked about from the beginning of Adam, really, well, all the way to the end to his journey when they get into the getting ready to go into the promised land. And so it's going to include Genesis and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and all those 5 books. It's going to be all in one book, and he calls that the book of the law. That Moses commanded, and then Moses commanded. Okay, let's see. So it was when Moses had completed the writing of the words, he's done all the writing of this law in a book, when they were finished, that Moses commanded the Levites who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and put it besides the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there as a witness against you. So you got the 10 tablets that are inside the ark, which are the 10 commandments, the 10 words, the 10 categories. We can go into that another time. But then there's this book that covers everything that he talked about, about how to do an offering and how to sacrifice and how to when to keep Sabbath. All these details are written into this book of the law. And it's sitting behind it on the side of the covenant. Now, everything that's supposed to be in that tabernacle is supposed to be in the one in the heavens. And so I'm saying that it seems to be Jubilees. Maybe they understand that. I don't know. But the heavenlies has this same document. And they call it the heavenly tablets. And in the heavenly tablets, it was ordained. And then they just say that stuff. And they document stuff like that. We'll touch on those. Let's see, let's skip that one. So this book of the law, this is a dramatization from the book that Thou Mayst Prosper by Ray Sutton. And it's very interesting. And it's talking about 2 Kings. And it says, a young Israelite king, that was Josiah. He was 8-year-old when he became a king, but he was a teenager at this moment. Not very old. Young Israelite king was sitting on his throne one day. He may have been bored, he may have been worried, but he decided to spend his day counting all the money that had come into the treasury. And in those days, the money was kept in the temple, so he sent a messenger to perform the task. When the messenger arrived and he, a priest, began to calculate the king's wealth as they moved the great chests of gold back and forth, and the king's messenger found a strange object. He found something resembling a time capsule. And the messenger called the priest slowly. They unrolled the ancient manuscript and found inside it was a message from their ancestors. Both knew immediately what they had found, and they wept as their eyes raced through the document, reading of the time gone by that obligated them to greatness. The king had to be told, and the priest was selected to take the document to him. And at first he walked, then he ran. And the guards outside the king's palace were instructed to move out of the way, for he had a message from the past. Running into the king's court, interrupting the proceedings, the priest bowed and held the document up to the king. Reaching out, the teenager grasped the manuscript in his hand, and he stood frozen as a statue, for it seemed to be a time without end. Everyone in the court, covered with gold, silver, precious jewels, waited speechlessly to see what the king was going to do. Then he looked up, but his eyes did not meet the numb faces of those encircling him. They stretched up to the heavens. And then he cried out before all the court, God, forgive me and my people. And he tore his clothes and fell on his face, pleading for God's mercy. What had just happened? This is a great little story, right? What had happened? They're cleaning, they're moving the chest, and then they find the book of the law that obligated them to greatness, right? And it goes on, and that once Josiah sees this, he begins immediately to go out and to destroy the priest that burns incense on the high hills and under the green trees, and he says, pull out the Baal and the Ashtaroth articles out of the temple. This is idolatry. They were already in the temple. They were operating like this. Because they hadn't been reading the book of the law. And he smashes the Canaanite altars into dust, and he just completely reverses all that fake worship, right? You know, and Baal is sun god worship, and Ashtaroth is fertility goddess worship, which is somewhat related to Christmas and Easter. You know, that's not my opinion. So they were pulling out Christmas and Easter articles out of the temple? And this is restoring worship? Sounds good to me. And then in 2 Kings 23:25, it says this about Josiah, that all that he had done. Now before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all of his heart, with all of his soul, and all of his might, according to all the law of Moses. Nor after him did anyone like him arise. This includes David. This includes all the kings, that no one came to the Lord with all of his heart and all of his soul and all of his might. That's the Shema, right? And several times in Deuteronomy, God says, this is how I want you to love me, with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, and it's always attached to keep these things that I'm commanding you today. It's attached to the hip. You can't separate them. So you want to love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. It's attached to doing the instructions that he's given us on how to love him and how to behave And it's all about kingdom behavior, to love your king and love your neighbor. It's a love thing. Okay, Torah before Moses' tablets. Let's go through that. 2 Peter 2:5. And did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of the 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodliness. Go through the entire Old Testament, you'll not find anywhere where it says Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Where's Peter's source? You go to Jubilee 7:20. In the 28th Jubilee, Noah began to enjoy upon all of his sons the ordinance and the commandments and the judgments that he knew. This is Moses' language. Hukat, mishpatim, mishpots, right? This is the same thing that Moses was given at the law. And Jubilees is saying these were given to the sons of Noah that he knew. He knew these. And he exhorted his sons to observe righteousness. So here in Jubilee 7:2, that this is the only source that we can find where people would have pulled that Noah was a preacher of righteousness was from the Jubilees account. Genesis 3. So when the woman saw that there was a tree for good food, that it was pleasant to the eye, and the tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Then both their eyes were opened. Right? It wasn't until Adam and ate, and then all of a sudden both, because they're echad, they're one. As soon as Adam eats, both their eyes are open. They've crossed the line. What did they do? They sinned. Paul says in Romans 5:12 that sin, that's breaking the law of God, the instructions of God, came into the world by one man. That's Adam. That's these guys right here. Sin entered into the world at the beginning on Genesis 3. You got the Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the thing. Flip 3 pages over and they've already screwed things up, right? 3 pages. We got, another 36,000 pages to go, and we're already done at 3. But here, sin entered into the world because of Adam and Eve. How can you sin? Sin is the transgression of the law. Sin is lawlessness. How can you break the law unless you already have it, right? They must have known that there was a law, accountability. We'll see more. In Hosea 6:7, he says, but like Adam, so Hosea 6 is talking to the northern tribe. This is the ones that got carried off to Assyria. And Hosea is talking to the northern tribe. They got divorced, kicked out of the house. And he says, but like Adam, the one in the garden, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me. God's speaking here. And he says that Adam transgressed. What's transgression? 1 John says, transgression of the law is, breaking the law is transgression of the law. It's transgression means you had an agreement. You broke that agreement, that's a transgression. So Adam had an agreement. Doesn't say that, but God's holding him accountable here in Hosea 6. So it says here, the margarine rendering supplies the strongest meaning that God made a covenant with Adam and promised him blessings of paradise on condition of obedience. He broke the condition, transgressed the covenant, and was driven from the divine home. Like Israel, who had violated all the terms of which the godly land of conditional promise had been bestowed. So just like Adam violated, transgressed the law, was kicked out of the divine law. out of the divine paradise. Israel, in the land of milk and honey, violated the law. Like Adam, you got to go. In Hosea 6, it says they transgressed. You don't see transgression until Moses brings it on the stage on the mountain, right? What are they talking about, transgression? You can't be transgressing that something's not there. This is an agreement they had with God, and it was a covenant agreement. It was covenant before Moses. Laws before Moses. Was Adam a Jew or was he Israel? No, he was neither, right? So then can we honestly say that the law was only given to the Jews or it was only given to Israel? We're going to see, no, you can't say that. And you don't have to go to Jubilees to find that out. Genesis 4. And Abel brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering. But he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. His countenance is his face. So he got a grumpy face. And so the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? He says, if, stop sign, you do well, and that word means if you do what is acceptable, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well or what is acceptable, sin, and it's the word hatayah, the same one that Moses used, lies at the door, and a desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Okay? Abel brought the firstborn. How did he know to bring a firstborn? This is Genesis 4, right? That's not brought into the picture until Exodus 13:2. What's Abel doing? What kind of information does Abel have that tells him he has to bring in a firstborn? And he says, and of their fat. How does he know to bring the fat? That's not brought into the story until Leviticus 3. These are all Mosaic Mount Sinai instructions that Abel knew before the Torah was distributed in stone tablets, right? Was it the heavenly tablets that's in the heavens, and they had access to that, or there's a bigger picture going on. I don't have the whole answer there, but they had access to the instructions and to the requirements and what was acceptable long before Moses told them. And then you go on to verse 6. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why your countenance fell? If you do what is acceptable, will you not be accepted? So God is saying, Cain, you already know what's acceptable, right? He doesn't have to explain it to him. He says, go fix it. You already know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So he's holding Cain accountable to know what is acceptable. So if he's holding Cain to know what's acceptable, is he holding us to the same standard? Are we to understand what is acceptable to God and what is not acceptable? Because for Cain, he knew how to fix it, but he didn't fix it. Sin, hatiyah, lies at the door. And he says, and you need to rule over it, or it'll rule over you. All this is coming from the very beginnings of creation. Standards, covenants, sin, all before Moses talks about them. Was Cain a Jew or Israel? Was Cain given instructions? Was Abel given instructions? They were given the law and what was acceptable? Yes. So we can't say it was only given to the Jews or Israel. We're seeing it here in Exodus or Genesis 4. It was given in Genesis 4. Let's talk about somebody that's just average Joe here. And it says, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, indeed, you're a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. He says the penalty to take a man's wife, which he says you're about to commit adultery, and the penalty is death. That's not till Leviticus 20. And he says you're going to about ready to commit adultery, and you'll have to die. But Abimelech says, I had not come nearer. He said, Lord, will you slay the righteous also? So he knows that this Lord that came to him in dream has the power to slay the righteous. He respects his authority. Did he not say she was my sister, and she even herself said, he's my brother? He says, in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this. I didn't know. They told me. They lied to me. And God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart, for I also withheld you from sinning against me, therefore I did not let you touch her. So here's Abimelech about to commit adultery before Leviticus 20 is even mentioned, and God says, I prevented you from sinning, hatiyah, against me, your God, the God, right? Was Abimelech Jewish? Was he Israel? No. We got to stop saying that. This is a story about Joseph. We're still in the Old Testament. And Joseph, he was in charge of Potiphar's house. He was in charge of everything that do with Potiphar's house. And Potiphar's wife comes to him and makes advances towards him. And Joseph says, there is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he, Potiphar, kept anything back from me but you, because you are his wife. So everything else I'm in charge of, I don't have access to his wife. And then he says, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin, hatiyah, against God? Joseph knew what was a sin. He knew this is back to the adultery law in Leviticus 20. But long before Moses had told us, sin entered the world through one man. From the beginning, it was already in the play. And it was accountable. Cain was accountable. Adam and Eve were accountable. Joseph says, I don't want to be accountable. I'm not going there. Genesis 7. This is Noah. And he says, take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal and male and its mate, and the 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, male and its mate. How does Noah know what's clean and unclean? Right? Was it the heavenly tablets? They had access to this information. And not only do they have access, but they are held accountable for it, right? And not only is he collecting clean and unclean, he knows which ones he can use to sacrifice, because he does a burnt offering. Who told him how to do a burnt offering, right? Abraham, take your son, your only son, and take him up to the mountain I'll show you, and offer him as a burnt offering. How does Abraham know what a burnt offering is, right? This is knowledge of the Sinai covenant, the Mosaic covenant that everybody says has been done away with. All of this is from the beginning. It's a standard. Like Jubilee says, it's an eternal pre-existing condition, right? God doesn't have more than one standard. He's got one standard. And he communicated to those in the beginning. He communicated again, so it's not a brand new instructions from Moses. It's a retelling. Just like when Moses does it at Mount Sinai, he does it again and retells the instructions again at the end of Deuteronomy when they're getting ready to go in the land. It's like a renewing of the covenant that always came from the beginning, that was not wrote down, but they were held accountable. They knew about it. Genesis 26. And I will give all these lands. He's talking to Isaac. And he says, and I'm going to make the same deal I made with your father. And I will perform the oath, Shavah, which I swore to Abraham your father. And I'll make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give your descendants all the lands, and all the seed in the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And he says, I'm going to do this for you. And the reason why I did it for Abraham, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my Torah, my laws. Where did Abraham get all this information? And he knew how to keep them. He knew what is acceptable, the acceptable standard he had all the way back in Genesis 26. Was it heavenly tablets? The Mosaic Law was ordained. Now, here's another strange one. Right? The Mosaic Law was ordained or delivered by angels at Mount Sinai, acting as intermediate between God and Moses, as described in Galatians 3:19. Paul says the law was added because of transgressions and was mediated through angels. Well, you don't see that in Exodus 19. And Stephen is going off on the Pharisees. And he yells at him and says the same thing. These are, the law that you can't even seem to obey it was given to you by angels. It's a bizarre statement. It's confused me for a long time. And then in Hebrews 2. So 3 times in the New Testament it's speaking about that. And every time they mention it, they don't need to go into detail about it, because it's like they already know that everybody's familiar with this teaching. Where do they get it from? And in Hebrews 2:2 it says, for if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, standard, eternal, and every transgression and disobedience received a just reward, just like it did in the Old Testament. Adam and Eve received a just reward. Cain received his. And on and throughout. Sin has consequences. In the Old Testament, at Moses' time, and today. And then, so we see in Jubilees, so where do we find this, right? And the only place I could find it is Jubilees. That describes an angel of the premise delivering the heavenly tablets of the law, the Torah, the testimony, and history from creation to this final structure to Moses, and to the day of the new creation when heavens and earth shall be renewed. Jubilees is saying they gave this instructions from creation, and it's going all the way to the new heavens and new earth. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. We could break that apart in the regular Bible. Jubilee 6. And then it says, for this reason, it is ordained written on the heavenly tablets. Jubilees keeps mentioning these heavenly tablets. And I got to say, I agree that there's heavenly tablets. Is there tablets down here on the earth? There's information in the heavens. God wants it to be synchronized. that they should, so he says that in the heavenly tabernacle, it was ordained and written that they should celebrate the Feast of Weeks. That's Pentecost or Shavuot. And Shavuot, the word is Shava, and it means oath. So it's the Feast of Weeks. It's also the Feast of Oaths. Very, very powerful. And so, and it says in this whole festival, Pentecost, Shavuot, Feast of Oaths, was celebrated in the heavens from the day of creation. This is what Jubilees is saying. Till the days of Noah, 26 Jubilees, and Noah and his sons observed it for 7 Jubilees in 1 week until the days of Noah's death, and then from that day, Noah's death, his son stopped doing it until the days of Abraham. Then it goes on to say that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob celebrated the Feast of Shavuot long before Moses gave us the instructions, right? But they're saying here that Shavuot was celebrated in heaven from the day of creation. The day of creation. What day was that? That was in the beginning, right? That was on a Sunday. When is Shavuot? It's always on a Sunday, right? So that lines up. I'm okay with that. And then the first word in the Bible is Bereshit. It's the word bait. I got my Hebrew fact checker over here. She's taking notes, and she will correct me. Bless your heart. Bereshit, bait, meaning in, Reshit, right? Translates to in the beginning. What else does Bereshit translate into? So this is, they said at the Bereshit, the beginning, which was Sunday, Shavuot was practiced in heaven. Well, okay. That I don't have a problem so far. And then it says in Leviticus 23:10, it says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give to you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest." It's talking about Shavuot, Feast of Oats, Pentecost, right? "And you shall bring a sheaf of first fruits." Guess what that word is? Reshit. So this is a term that's talked about in Shavuot, that's saying that Jubilees is saying was celebrated on day one in Bereshit, on the day. So you could actually say in the first fruits at the beginning of the creation, God created the heavens and the earth. So, there seems to be biblical validation that Reshit and Bereshit and Sunday connected to Shavuot. So, we're really testing these things. And, if there's more information, please, let's talk about it, because I want to understand this completely. And I don't want to get sidetracked. And so it's important that we test each other and use all of you as a peer review, right? It's important. So then we go to Jubilees 3:9, and it says, "And after Adam had completed 40 days in the land where he had been created," that was in Eden, "we brought him into the Garden of Eden to keep it and to till it and keep it." And actually that's Shamar and Avad, to guard it and to work it. Priestly language, right? That's what the priests are given information in with Moses. They're to guard and to work it. temple stuff. So he was in the land of Eden, where had been created, and we brought him in from the garden into the Garden of Eden. Garden is, Jubilee says it's the Holy of Holies, right? And Jubilee isn't the only one that thinks that. There's plenty of scholars that break down the language of Genesis, like, that Adam and Eve were given priestly instructions, right? And then here we got them, they can't go into the sacred space or into the Holy of Holies except after the 40 days of his decontamination. And then his wife brought in on the 80th day, and after this she entered into the Garden of Eden. So they had to wait a period of time before they could go into the Holy of Holies or sacred space where God walked with them in the cool of the day. Leviticus 12. If a woman is conceived to born a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, and she shall continue in the blood of her purification 33 days. That's for a male child. You got 7 plus 33. That's 40. That lines up with Jubilees 3. And if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks in her customary impurity, and she shall continue in the blood of her purification 66 days. So 66 plus 14 is 80. So what is Jubilees quoting Leviticus 12? Because they're treating Adam and Eve as if they were just born, which I could see that, right? They were just come into the world. But Jubilees is treating them as they had to wait this defilement period, just as Leviticus does when a child is actually born. And so, heavenly tablets. Jubilee 16. And she shall bear a son in the 3rd month, in the middle of the month. So the 3rd month, that's the month of Sivan, and in the middle of the month, the 15th, at the time which the Lord had spoken to Abraham, on the festival of first fruits of the harvest, Isaac was born. On the festival of Reshit, in the 3rd month, in the middle of the month. That's Shavuot. So Jubilees is saying Isaac was born on Shavuot. On the Feast of Oaths. Was not Isaac, when he says, I raise my hand and swear by myself that Abraham, you will have a son this time next year at this moed. That's the oath. And then we see in Luke 1, it says, now in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent to God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And having come in, the angel said to her, rejoice, highly favored one. The Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women. And then he goes on to say, you're going to have a child. God's going to overshadow you. You're going to have a baby. Then she immediately leaves from Galilee to go to Jerusalem to go visit her cousin Elizabeth, which is probably about a 4-day journey. And when she gets there, Elizabeth goes, blessed is the fruit of your womb. She knows. And then John the Baptist in the womb kicks. He knows that she's carrying a child, right? So she was pregnant in the 6th month, which is the month of Elul. Count 9 months of pregnancy, and you get to the 3rd month, right? So New Testament is lining up with Jubilee 16. There doesn't seem to be a discrepancy there. These are all things we're testing and trying to dig in and understand. Is this what I should understand, or do I need to test it further? Or we can never stop testing stuff. No matter what we feel confident about, we can't stop testing it. Because I've changed my mind. It's a journey, not a destination, right? And I told people, yeah, I've changed my mind. Well, you're kind of flaky then, is what you're telling me. I go, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe you should be flaky too. 1 John 2:3. We're almost done. We'll close. 1 John 2:3, he says, now, by this we know that we know him. This is an intimate language. And him is Jesus. If we keep his commandments, whose commandments? Jesus' commandments. He who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar. Strong words, not mine. And the truth is not in him. But so whosoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in him. He who says he abides in him ought to himself also walk just as he walked. Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. Paul's agreeing with John here. I think we should walk like Jesus did. That's why I'm following him. And John's saying, you should do the same as Paul. Okay, last one. 1 John 2:3. So we've been describing all this stuff that was, all these instructions, commandments, and accountability from the very beginning on page 3 of the book, where it all goes downhill. And it says, now by this we know, okay, this is not it. Okay, 1 John 2:7. So John is talking to him, and he says, brethren, I write no new commandment to you. No, emphasize. New, Greek, kahinos. And it means to be new and improved, right? He says, I'm not writing a new and improved one, but an old commandment which you have heard from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you have heard from the beginning. Okay? No new and improved commandment, but an old commandment, right? That word old is pleios in the Greek, and it means like old wineskin, right? Or not recent, or ancient, right? So the Greek has a larger choices of possibilities you could translate that as. But then if you go and see how the equivalent of that word in the Hebrew, it's Strong 6268, and it's the Hebrew word atik in Hebrew. And it's translated as ancient. And there's only 3 places in the entire Old Testament that the word atik is used as ancient. And they're all in Daniel 7, and he says, and he went to the Ancient of Days. All 3 of those, the only 3 times this word is used as is in the Ancient of Days. Who's that? That's an eternal being that's never began or never ended. So we could say that I write no unapproved commandment to you, but Ancient of Days commandment, right? Which you have had from the beginning. Now, what's this word for beginning? It's the Greek word arche. And when you see in the Greek, when it starts off with Genesis in the Septuagint, it says, in the arche. This word arche is the equivalent of Bereshit. It's the word for beginning that connects to Bereshit, which connects to first fruits. And so you could translate it, what you have heard from Bereshit, from the first word in the first line of the Bible. I write no new and approved commandment, but of an Ancient of Days commandment, which you had heard from the beginning of creation. Could we translate it as that? I think we could put it on the table. And the old commandment is the word which you already heard that came from the beginning, right? So this is agreeing with all the Old Testament, that Adam and Cain and Joseph and all those guys were very aware of what was acceptable, what they were accountable for. And Jubilees is saying the same thing. Jubilees ain't saying anything different, right? They're giving more details, but it doesn't change what the big picture they're trying to prove. And I'm suggesting 1 John 2:7 says it came from the beginning, from an Ancient of Days commandment, right? So we'll just close with that, but we have to do like apologetics, and when we hear somebody say, "Oh, that was given to the Jews," that was given. No, those are for the laws are for Israel, and they say, "Well, okay, can we talk about that? Show me how you come to that conclusion, because I think we're reading the same Bible, and I come to a different conclusion, right?" Because if it wasn't given to just Jews and Israel, then it was given to mankind. Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man. That word is anthropos, and it means mankind. The first mankind on the scene was Adam and Eve. So Jesus said this commandment, this Sabbath, was made for Adam and Eve, which was man, the first mankind, which comes from the Ancient of Days commandment, which came from the very first words of the Bible, right? Jesus is attaching the Sabbath for an accountability to Adam and Eve. And if you have breath in your lungs and you're a moral being and image of God, we're accountable, right? So, let us strive that we can begin to never stop trying to be like the tabernacle on the mountain, right? To be that worship center, to do the instructions that were given at the beginning, and then it's a journey, not a destination. And as we come into understanding, then we're accountable, right? And so let us understand what is acceptable to God, what Cain was expected to be acceptable. Let us understand and fully learn those things so that we may be acceptable and do the things acceptable to God, and to further continue our journey as a tabernacle or the worship center on earth. That said, I said God bless and thank you.